Okay. When we were going over this before, I had come to a sort of a halt with the sort of the issue of the idea of spiritual twins, but probably more importantly, the idea that this idea of mana being something that's basically acquired. In other words, you have it, but you constantly need to have it replenished. And that's one of the main, or if not the main function of what are oftentimes what we call gods or other deities, but it's also the idea of the Aumakua and pipeline relationship. The other thing to remember with the Aumakua is the reason the Aumakua helps, so you have this twin, is the idea that kinship is central to this entire process. An abstracted God who isn't related to you would have no interest in you. So any sort of a relationship is necessary to acquire mana. And so in the traditional Polynesian societies, the idea that your relationship with the land and the spirits of the land is that they give you mana. But then if you were to go somewhere else, you wouldn't have those relationships. Therefore, you wouldn't have that access. So what it meant to a certain extent is once you moved to a place and sort of got linked into it, there was a real temptation to just sort of stay in that place because the options, if you were moving, were quite risky. And to a certain extent, you know, the chance of it going well was pretty small. So there's always sort of this flip-flop between the idea of discovery, moving to new locations, you know, setting up a new situation, but also the idea that there was a lot of risk involved at sort of a spiritual or mana level, which I don't think really comes across the Western accounts. This idea of Western exploration is usually an intellectual thing. It's not seen as a ritually risky or actually life risky phenomenon. So we can go to the next one. Okay. What happens in Polynesia is Polynesia, this initial settlement, sort of the central region, splits into two areas. You can sort of make the split as, say, the society group in areas further east. The areas further west, Samoa, Tonga, etc., pretty much stay in a sort of a classic mode on this idea of family and the idea of relationships and structured family. In Eastern Polynesia, what happens is it becomes more formalized. And I've never seen a really good discussion of this. Ganalje goes into a little discussion of maybe why. But even in his case, it's not really too clearly defined because we just don't know. There's no real oral traditions that explain the change. It's just so like, okay, here is the change. So you find in Eastern Polynesia, people talk about and of course have the concept of family, and it's still central. What you also end is now sort of an overlay. Now this overlay to a certain extent spills back into Central Polynesia, where you start to get the idea of within the idea of the ainga, of the large family, that you end up with different groups of the family. Some groups of the family are more senior, and you end up with senior and junior lineages. And that seems to have been around for a while, and maybe was there for a really long time. But in Eastern Polynesia, this becomes much more formalized, and you see what eventually sort of shows up here. And this is the idea of, excuse me, of basically people breaking into three groups. And the key with the three groups here is that the three groups are seen as different types of people. To the extent they're almost physically different. More accurately, what happens is they're seen as having differential abilities to acquire mana, differential abilities to develop mana. So what happens is that somewhere along the line, there becomes a logic that sort of becomes embedded, which is that different types of people actually are physiologically different. And that difference is reflected in mana. The folks that have the most mana, or more accurately, the ability to acquire the most mana, become called Ariki, which eventually up here becomes called Alii. The folks that would be in the sort of second tier would be the Raratira, which, you know, we'll get to that later when it comes into here. The group on the bottom, the majority of the population becomes called the Manahune. So what happens is unlike Central Polynesia, these become split into separate populations in the sense that the chiefs become distinctive and intermarry in the chiefs and segregate themselves from the Manahune, et cetera, et cetera. And so these become your three tiers that we've got here in the panel. Why it occurs, hard to tell. You'd have to go back in time. What it means, though, is that you end up with different groups, and because they have spiritual distinctiveness, the logic is that the Manahune have to support the Ariki because the Ariki have access to mana, which they can then give to the Manahune. So what happens is, versus the Central Polynesian version, in Eastern Polynesia, the ability of the majority of the population to acquire mana becomes pretty much mediated, if you would, or controlled by the Ariki, which we might call chiefs. And so that gives them their status and their power. And the common population puts up with that because they buy into the logic. So if you would, this becomes a combination of social class situations and also to obviously religiously based. What you then find, not surprisingly, given that, is then you end up with regulations about who can access what, who can access when, with the idea that you have to protect these Ariki from possible disruption of their mana. And so this becomes what in Hawaii, or in Central Polynesia or Eastern Polynesia called tapu, which here becomes called kapu, is basically the regulations to make sure that the mana of the chiefs, the mana of the Ariki is not disturbed, so therefore they can give it out. So what happens is the taboos are basically placed on the Manahune, so that the chiefs can acquire and distribute mana. Of course, all this becomes a huge status thing too, which we saw a little bit in that video. What you also see then is the role of marae. Is what happens then is the traditional system would have been that there would be a small, either upright or small platform or a small stack of stones, which would be where the family would do ceremonies and interact with their akua or omokua. And they would do that, and that would be called an ahu. And each family would have their own. In fact, in many cases, in much of Polynesia, what you find is each household has their own, and then each family has a larger one. So this was all done at the family level, with senior members of the family running these things. When you end up with this class society coming into place, then what you start to see is the building of more formalized structures. And then what you see is more, along with the specialization socially, is you end up with religious or ritual specialization. You end up with Tonga, whose job is to basically run the rituals so that the Ariki acquire mana. So you end up with this very complicated scenario in place of all sorts of different hierarchies of people who basically are involved in this generation or acquisition or distribution of mana. And you have this occurring on particular ritual locations, which you then build up into large ritual centers called, at least in most of Eastern Polynesia, marae. That term disappears here. It gets replaced with the word heao, but they work exactly the same way. So when you look at a marae in Eastern Polynesia, what you're looking at is a structure whose formal purpose was the generation of mana. Think of it as a power generator. And what happens then is the relative role of the family in ritual generation, mana acquisition sort of shrinks. Families keep their family or household ahu, but now they're also expected to engage in these larger ritual complexes that occur at marae, which can involve entire islands, entire districts, and then you end up with this hierarchy of chiefs and the hierarchy of the tonga, or the priest, I guess you could call them, that basically run these ceremonies. So this is the change that occurs. This all occurs prior to the Westerners. This is a Polynesian thing. Now, what happens around 1500, we're not sure exactly when, is we have a lot of the oral traditions about this. We actually have the accounts that the Europeans have when they bumped into it. We're not really too sure what happened or when it happens. We're pretty sure about what happens. Somewhere in Eastern Polynesia, probably the Marquesas, because that's where all the accounts point to. A guy gets a vision. He is talked to by a god. A god visits him, I assume maybe in his sleep or whatever. And this god presents that the world of Polynesia has become screwed up. This god that talks to this guy is called the god Oro. And the god Oro basically says that the existing social religious system is not right. It's null, it's unclean. And what his job that the god gives him this task. This task is to bring the new cleansing religion to replace the dirty old religion. Now, the dirty old religion basically is the whole sort of Matai Inga system of family. This new religion, this is a very structured religion. So the Eastern Polynesian thing about Iki and Tonga and stuff like that is actually part of this whole Arioi thing, but it expands. So this is sort of like a new amplified version. Now the key here to remember is this is an entirely Polynesian religion. It has nothing to do with Westerners. This is someone in the Marquesas, most likely, who gets a vision. For some reason, his vision is so compelling and he's able to convince other people of it, that this becomes a religious movement. So it's an in-place new religion that occurs starting in Eastern Polynesia. It spreads really, really, really quickly. We're not sure why it was so popular. When I get to it, I look at lower down, it's sort of a very unusual religion, but it becomes hugely popular. It's also very, very unusual in several regards. One of the key ones is that you no longer have family. A family is gutted. A family is not relevant. What is family? Family is replaced is by basically a caste system in terms of who's involved and who can't be involved. So you separate the society into two groups. The group that you're talking to is the elites. The elites, the Ariki, are the only groups that actually can be members of the religion, which becomes called Arioi. So that's the religion started by this new Messiah. And so the rest of the population, the Manahune, cannot be members of the religion per se. They can help support the religion. They gain, I assume, benefits from the religion, I assume maybe through mana or something like that. But what it becomes very clear, at least in the way this religion presents itself, the Arioi present themselves, is mana is entirely controlled by four gods. Those four gods will only interact with the Ariki through the intercession of the Tonga. Everyone else is entirely at the mercy of that structure. And their job is to basically support that structure. So this is an entirely new concept. You basically just erase the whole concept of the centrality of family, of the centrality of place, and you replace it with this idea of a portable, specialized religion that's only open to certain elites. Very, very different. The key with the Arioi is a whole set of really sort of unusual practices. First off, and the Europeans noted this because they bumped into it a bunch of times, is that the religion was actually nomadic. What you would do is the Ariki of a particular cluster of islands would actually stay there for a period of time. They'd pretty much eat the place out of food. And when they were done with whatever they wanted to do there, they would literally pack up in canoes and they would sail to another island's cluster of islands. So this thing basically moved from island group to island group or from island cluster to island cluster throughout Eastern and to a certain extent Central Polynesia. So it moved around, so it wasn't place-based. So you didn't have this tie to the landscape. In fact, you have no tie to the landscape per se for the elites. The main function of the Ariki is not to actually engage in anything that's functionally useful. Their main job is to keep the gods happy. And they do that through a combination of dance and chanting to constantly honor the gods, especially the god Oro, who sort of becomes like an overseer of all this. And this becomes the four gods of Eastern and Polynesia, which eventually becomes the four gods here. Other things that were really unusual about this religion, within the group of elites, there was not supposed to be the idea of couples. There was an intentionally explicit ritual promiscuity, and people were supposed to sleep with any other members of the group, not with anyone outside. Manahune were not allowed at all into this. When they moved to a new group, one of the more chilling things Europeans noticed, which also became a big issue in the 1700s, was when you moved into a new region, you'd actually kidnap young elites and forcibly bring them in as members, usually through group rape. So what you would do is you'd take the kids and you'd actually force them into the religion to the point where they no longer could, their family couldn't accept them anymore. And that becomes your new members. And the reason for that, this is one of the weirder parts of the whole religious movement, is they practice birth control. The Arioi could only expand or keep the numbers up by virtue of acquiring new members. They couldn't birth members. So there are all sorts of brutal accounts of the various types of ways that you basically make women miscarry, so that the women in the in this religion could not generate children. So the religion constantly had to move around from place to place just to replace its members. It was very, very explicit that only the Ariki could be members. Everyone else's purpose was to serve that. And by serving it, that only meant providing food and housing and whatever else they needed. It also meant in terms of sacrifice. The Madai of the Arioi were what we usually call Pu'uhonua here. They were human sacrifice Madai. You sacrificed people on the Madai to honor these gods. And in doing so, because you gave the gods human life, the gods would give you mana, or allow you to access the mana. This would be done through the Daungus, the priest. So what you end up with is a spectacularly different religion, because in traditional Polynesian society, you didn't have human sacrifice, or if you did, it would be the senior member of the family who pissed off the local family akua, who would have to apologize by virtue of giving your life. So it would be within the family. This is entirely different. You shop around and grab people. You engage in conflict for the purpose of acquiring people that you then sacrifice at a Manai. And so what happens is this starts in our case, moves very quickly through Tahiti. It's in the society group around Tahiti that the Europeans bump into this. And I suppose that to a certain extent that's an advantage, because the Europeans are totally shocked by this. And it's explained very carefully to them by Tahitians that this is not the traditional way we do things. This is the new way things are done. And for various reasons, the Arioi and the Europeans get into it fairly frequently. So the Europeans have some pretty detailed accounts of what the Arioi was about, just because it was getting in their way. And in fact, when Tahitian or society sort of restabilizes, it's as an anti-Arioi movement. Michener's Taipei is the classic example of this. He's an American sailor at a whaling ship. He either pisses off the captain, or so I can't remember exactly what happens, to go read it. They literally throw him overboard as they're sailing through the Marquesas. He swims to land. I believe this is early 1800s. And he happens to end up on the island that's actually the last island that's controlled by Arioi. By this period of time, the various social, political groups in Eastern Polynesia have decided this Arioi is just too bad of a deal, and they pretty much erase them. So there's this one island, they're still sort of like their last refuge. And ironically, Michener ends up in there. For some reason, they don't kill him. For some reason, they actually sort of take him in as almost like a pet. So he's kept there for a period of time. He eventually escapes, goes back, becomes most famous for writing Moby Dick. But he also writes a book called Taipei, which is actually a pretty good ethnographic religious account of his time, as well, so you can figure out what was going on, that he spent within this religious cult in the early 1800s, when they were their last gasp, as it were. So we actually have a sort of semi-ethnographic account of what this was all about. So if you look at the Tahiti stuff, Tahiti was the center point of all this. So what happens is that you end up with a structured system that the Arioi bring on. The Arioi end up controlling all of Tahiti for a period of time, all the society groups. They move into Samoa and Fiji and Tonga temporarily. They get thrown out of those regions further in the central region. So their stronghold becomes basically the society group in East through the Marquesas Tuamotus. By the late early 1800s, their excesses are such that they're pretty much chucked out and then become limited to a few islands, especially the one that Michener finds them on. So this is the group. So when the Europeans are bumping into Tahiti and bumping into Tahitian society in the 1700s, it's a society which has already been impacted and largely structured by the Arioi religious, experience. Sorry, the cat's upset here. And so this is what you get. You end up with a classic structured society. Family is there, but family now becomes the constraint of social rank. The Ariki are entirely separate from the rest of the society. In the middle group is the Ra'atira, who are also separate from the Manahuni. And at the bottom of the Manahuni, so this has become a caste system. It's no longer a family-based system. It's very much based on what your genealogy is, now describes your position in the society, which is one reason why genealogical chants becomes so hugely important in Eastern Polynesia, and then later, of course, here in Hawaii, is because the genealogy defines who you are socially and who you can contact and what your rank and power is defined by birth, versus just, who my family is, which would be the more Central Polynesian thing. What you find here also is that now you end up in a situation where the folks that are in charge, the Ariki, will have these ceremonies at which they display the ability that they can motivate and move an entire population, which again isn't surprising because you think of the whole Arioi thing is basically going to an island group and basically just eating it dry. So now what you end up is the Ariki will have these various ceremonies during the year in which they basically order everyone to provide them with resources, which they then again redistribute to as an illustration of their enormous power. This isn't based on island, it isn't based on family, this is based on region. Underneath them are a set of Aratira or lesser chiefs whose job is basically to manage all this. The Taonga would come from the ranks of the Ariki. So the folks that are doing the religious rituals on your religious sites, your marae, would be from the ranks of the Ariki. Underneath all of this, of course, is the people that have to provide all the services, which in this period of time, you could argue that pretty much the term Manahuni becomes the equivalent of peasant in Europe. These are people who basically now are entirely at the mercy of this elite population who does not see themselves as the same type of person. So Manahuni were probably place-based. Manahuni probably still had some of these, and in fact, we know they had this idea of family and the idea of, sort of which would be typical in Central Polynesia. But now you've got this almost overlay, which has an entirely different set of agendas, an entirely different logic, which is further collecting a sort of self-amplification, if you want to think of it that way. So what happens if you go back and they're just sort of sketched out, if we go to this next one. And here's what the archaeologists have. Your first phase would be your classic sort of family-based Central Polynesian system. By the 1500s, 1600s, we don't have good dates in it, but say 1500 probably more likely, end up with what's oftentimes called the Manama. And we actually see this in the landscape archaeologically. All of a sudden you end up with large complexes on very complex ritual sites. You end up with all sorts of oral traditions of competing families, competing groups, competing island populations, competing Ariki, who are starting to acquire extra islands. So no longer does your family relationship to the land define what you're going to be. Now you're going to be, if you're Ariki, you can define it by virtue of, who's got the best army, basically. In the late 1700s, this is replaced by a particular family group, I believe from Morea, but I could be wrong, who basically rise up against the Arioi, and in process of doing this, unify much of the island group against the Arioi, the oral religious population, and in doing so, sort of put themselves in a position of superiority. And for the Europeans, these become the kings. These become the Ariki Aimoi, if you want to think of it, of the Tahitian group. These are the Pomades, who, not surprisingly, just like their Hawaiian counterparts, convert to Christianity to basically get European support for their agenda. And they end up in charge under the French for the next, well, there's still Pomades around. They're not very visible in the last 60 or 70 years, but they were a very powerful force in the period. So what you have is basically, archaeologically, we actually see this religious movement, or you might say the social impacts of this religious movement. And of course, on top of all this, one of the side aspects, just sort of as a note, if you go back to the Arioi, on this idea of dance and chant becomes in many cases pretty sexually explicit, because one of the things that they have as a logic is in the process of having sex, the sex act becomes a way to give mana or give honor to the high gods. So not surprisingly, what happens is you end up with the dance and chant become in many ways pretty sexually explicit, because that's actually part of what the Ariki are supposed to do. They're supposed to engage in sexual activity as a form of respect and a gifting, if you would, to Oro and the other high gods. So not surprisingly, when the Europeans see this, this just even more amplifies their idea of, on one hand, Polynesians being innocent children, on the other hand, the sort of sexualization of Polynesia just gets totally ramped up because the Europeans are pretty, bolt down, are watching these dance scenes, and they're just, it's porn as far as they're concerned. But on the other hand, they're hugely entranced by it. So it just reinforces this whole thing, which is, of course, it's a huge part of the tourism industry still in Polynesia, is the idea of the tomane type dance, which if you go into YouTube and you look at the various contests, by even today, a lot of what you'll see in the society group in terms of dance would be pretty. I mean, you see it here in Hawaii, but you probably wouldn't see it done at a school, for example. It would be considered sort of an adult thing. And so this is still one of the huge differences between hula here and Tahitian, quote, traditional dance in Tahiti, is the different way it presents itself. And sort of in some ways by Hawaiian standards, pretty explicitly sexual nature of Eastern Polynesian dance is intentional. It's actually a leftover from this Oro Arioi period. Of course, the Europeans jump all over this, and it just reinforces, it sets a whole new set of fantasies, which you still see if you go to a Polynesian review or a luau or something like that. It's this whole idea of the traditional Polynesian style of dance, which probably wasn't really traditional. If you think of Samoan Tongan dance, it tends to be much more structured, much more formalized. And that's probably the original form of dance, but that again goes back to family. It's not part of this God thing. So it's sort of to tie up all this, which ended with a hugely important impact of the religious movement that occurs in Eastern Polynesia in terms of reshaping Polynesian societies, but also in many ways setting up a new set of what then becomes consumed by the Europeans as stereotypes. And then reinforces what you still see today as stereotypes that Euro-American, Australian, and even Asians have. Polynesian is generated by this period of change. And I'll send you a link to an example of one of the recent Tahitian contests if you want to see it. So, okay, with that.